All right, hi everybody. I'm Molly Foley-Healy. I recognize many of your faces. Thanks for coming today at lunch in the middle of the summer when it's so beautiful out. Who wants to sit and talk about HOAs? But I'm glad you're here. And how many of you have been to my classes before? Several of you. I recognize many of your faces. All right, as you know, the way I do it is I really try to be very interactive and very casual. So if stuff comes up as we go along, I'll try to answer questions, but if that starts taking up all of the time, I'll probably hold questions till the end. But if you have questions as we go along, let's try to address them during the PowerPoint presentation. I'm happy to chat with you. Go ahead, Cindy. All right, so we have the most exciting topic to start with, and it's called budget ratification. And the reason I wanted to address this is because a year ago, the law changed in Colorado about HOAs and how budgets for associations are ratified, okay? How many of you know what a pre-Kiowa community is? All right, I put it in your first slide. So that's a community that was created before July 1st of 1992. And how do you figure out if you are one of those or not? If you're a condominium association, you look at the condominium declaration. If you're a single-family home community, you look at the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. And on the front page should be recording information that says when it was recorded with the clerk and recorder of Pitkin County, Colorado, when it was originally recorded. If it's before July 1st of 1992, you're what I will refer to as a pre-Kiowa community. Kiowa stands for the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, CCIOA. It's the state body of law that regulates HOAs in Colorado, okay? And then Kiowa communities, meaning all provisions of Kiowa apply to you, are those communities that were created on July 1st of 1992 or after. Okay, I have a large practice up in this area, and I know also with affordable housing with the APCHA housing communities that a lot of you are pre-Kiowa communities, okay? There's several of you who were created before July 1st in 1992. There's several that are after, but it's really going to be important because for budget ratifications, it's going to tell you what you need to do, okay? So let's start out with Kiowa communities. And what happens with budget ratification. And again, those are those communities created on or after July 1st of 1992. Believe it or not, those of you who know me know I specialize in HOA law. And I have a lot of declarations that were recorded one day before Kiowa became effective. So even though developers were creating these communities, they didn't want them to be Kiowa communities. So you could think you're a new community and really be a pre-Kiowa community. So anyhow, how does budget ratification work? First of all, let's be clear why budgets matter. Budgets cover the expenses and income of the association, and your budget is the document that determines what the assessments, which is just another word for dues, what the dues are going to be for the upcoming fiscal year. Okay? So you can't set dues appropriately and responsibly if you don't have a budget, right? Because it's really based on the expenses of the community. So what happens is for Kiowa communities, yes, did you have a question? Oh, I thought I saw your hand. So for Kiowa communities, and this should also be in the declaration that governs your community, is that what happens in the process is prior to the fiscal year beginning, I like to see it 60 days ahead of time, 90 days, for the budget to be, a proposed budget to be approved by the board. The board of directors or board of managers of your association approves a proposed budget, okay? And how many of you are self-managed, meaning you don't have a manager that manages your, how many of you have managers? Yes, yeah, outside. Well, either way. A manager is probably the one who's going to really work with the board to prepare a budget. if you are a managed community. If you're not, you are going to be working as boards of directors to try to look at the past expenses, the line items for expenses, and prepare your budget for the upcoming fiscal year. Then once you have a budget, the board looks at it, they approve a proposed budget. And within 90 days, this is statutory, okay? And that's why there's so much writing. But within 90 days after approving the proposed budget, the board is required to send, or your manager, if you've got management, send a copy of the proposed budget or a summary of it to all of the homeowners, along with a notice of meeting for a meeting to consider the budget. Okay, so in terms of when your notice of meeting it has to go out, when it has to be set, go to your bylaws of your association and look at the section on membership meetings. Your bylaws will tell you typically, although sometimes up here I've noticed bylaws don't have time frames, but if your bylaws have a period of time that says you have to send the notice not more than 15 days or less than 30 days prior to the meeting, you've got to set your meeting date so you're sending the notice of meeting and your proposed or summary of the budget within the requirements of the bylaws. So look at your bylaws for notice of meeting. If your bylaws are silent, the notice of meeting has to be sent at least 10 days, but no more than 50 days prior to the meeting to consider the proposed budget. The proposed budget can be handled at now the owners are the ones who are going to vote on, the members, the proposed budget, okay? So it can either be handled at an annual meeting, if that time frame works for you. If it doesn't, you need to call a special membership meeting to consider the proposed budget, all right? So then you have the meeting, and for Kiowa communities, if what you do is look at your declaration provision, okay? Because for Kiowa communities, it will be one of two things. Either 51% of all owners have to vote to, this is going to be weird to listen to, veto the budget, or it's automatically approved, or a larger percentage as set forth in your declaration. So you go to the article dealing with assessments, that's where your budget section is going to be in your declaration, and look at, if you're a Kiowa community, look at whether or not they require a veto of a larger number than 51% of all owners. Let me be clear about that. It's 51% of all owners. It's not 51% of quorum at the meeting. Or it's, a lot of times you'll see 67% of all owners are required to vote to veto the budget. If that percentage doesn't vote to veto the budget, it's automatically deemed approved, even if you don't have quorum at the meeting. So if your bylaws say you need 20% of owners present at a meeting to have quorum, we know we can't elect directors without quorum. You can still go through budget ratification whether or not quorum is present at the meeting. All right? So it's kind of backwards. I always have members scratching their heads like, why don't I vote to approve it? Because under Kiowa, what it requires you to do is vote on whether or not you're going to veto the budget. And unless the requisite number of owners don't vote to veto it, it's automatically deemed approved. So it's kind of counterintuitive. It's not the normal way we vote on things, okay? Now this is true if you're a Kiowa community, even if your declaration has some kind of an affirmative vote in it, because Kiowa is going to trump the provisions of your declaration. So let's go to the next slide. So what if you're one of those pre-Kiowa communities? So those are communities created before July 1st of 1992. All right, this is different, guys. So, you know, I see two different types of declarations, and sometimes this will be in your bylaws, so go ahead and check that out too. I see two types of scenarios. The most common one for pre-Kiowa communities is the declaration will just say the board sets the budget, which means they determine the assessments. right? And they don't have any kind of caps or limits on assessment increases. Some pre-Kiowa communities have caps on how much every year the board of directors can increase the budget. Sometimes I'll see it'll be based on the consumer price index. Sometimes declarations will say you can't increase the yearly assessment over last year's assessment by more than 3%, which can be a problem if nobody ever increased your budget and you've got a major deficit for doing major maintenance repairs or other obligations of the association. But if your declaration has a minimum amount that you can increase the assessments or has a specified way to do that, as long as the board's proposed budget stays within those confines of what your declaration says, you don't have to have any vote on it unless your declaration requires it. But you do have to have a meeting. So like I said in the last slide, you have to send out a copy of the proposed budget to the owners, and you either have to consider the budget at the meeting, at your annual meeting or a special meeting. You don't vote on it. People just have an opportunity to review the budget and ask questions. Okay, yes?
To be clear, an HOA is required at least to have an annual meeting.
HOAs, yeah, you have to have an annual meeting unless, let me be clear about this. If your HOA is a non-profit corporation, which 99% of them are, you can handle the budget ratification and the election of directors through an action outside of a meeting. But talk to your lawyer about that, because that is a very specific statutory process. But I want you to have an annual meeting, okay? Once a year. Give people a chance to interface with the board, ask questions, the board interface with the membership. Really, the intent is to, on a yearly basis, have an annual meeting, okay?
Can you just repeat what you said about you don't, if you're pre-Kiowa, you don't have to elect your directors at the meeting for whatever
All right,
reason?
so let's say you can, and this happens, it happens up here, it happens. So the question is, do you have to elect directors at an annual meeting? What I see up here with older communities, and frankly, many communities where it's second home communities, right, and people don't live here. And I see this in the Front Range too, down in the Denver area, is I have some communities that have a really difficult time getting quorum at an annual meeting. Have you run into that? Nobody shows up? Unless you're having an assessment increase. Then everybody in the community will show up, along with someone like me who hates those meetings. But anyhow, you can do an action by written ballot under the Nonprofit Act to elect directors if you cannot get quorum at your annual meeting. Sometimes associations...
One more time.
Okay, if you don't get quorum at your annual meeting to elect directors, under the Nonprofit Act, you can do an action by written ballot to elect directors. Okay? And talk to your lawyer when you get to that, because it's a very specific process, and there's statutory requirements you've got to comply with. All right?
What percentage have to vote for the new?
Okay, so the question is, under Kiowa, what percent, or the Nonprofit Act, if you do an action by written ballot to elect directors, what percent have to vote to approve? The same as if you were doing it at a meeting. So you have to have enough ballots returned that establish the quorum, the percentage for quorum. Yes, by written ballot. But a lot of times people will send in something by written ballot and they won't show up at a meeting.
Right.
So, well, it's not a proxy, it's a written ballot that each owner writes.
But what about pre-Kiowa?
Pre-Kiowa, you can, the Nonprofit Act still applies to pre-Kiowa communities with that. So you can do action by written ballot to elect directors for pre-Kiowa communities.
So otherwise you have to have a quorum?
Email only if your bylaws allow it. The Nonprofit Act does not recognize electronic balloting. And so unless your bylaws or your declaration permits it, if somebody challenges it, you could run into problems. Kiowa has not caught up to the year 2019. And so I really work with my clients, especially up here, because we've got a lot of hybrid stuff going on. A lot of elections where some people are sending in stuff electronically, other people are at the meetings. I try to work with my clients to amend the bylaws to make sure that we have the ability to cast ballots electronically. Okay, so that's something to look at. But
And the proxy authorization is sent out in advance of the annual meeting where you're voting on new board members, and then returned at the board meeting, so somebody is responsible for that vote.
yeah.
That's
So the question is, if a proxy is sent, so somebody hands somebody who's going to be at the meeting their proxy to act on their stead at the meeting. That's the way a lot of communities do get quorum, because it's people present in person or by proxy are counted toward quorum. So if you've got a lot of people who will hand in proxies, that's a great way to do it, and you don't have to do it by written ballot. Okay? Yes?
Molly, as you're going through this stuff today, can you reflect from time to time on the consequences of not doing these things? For instance, let's say an HOA
Hypothetically.
raises the assessments, raises the dues, but doesn't go through the proper process. Nobody complains about it, they pay their dues, blah, blah, blah. I mean, is somebody going to sue somebody down the road?
Okay.
Like, what are the consequences of not following these things? Because my guess is that my HOA is probably not the only HOA that doesn't follow
Right.
the letter of the law and just goes on doing what they do on a regular basis.
So the question is, what happens if you don't follow these requirements by law? So what happens is, it's fine until somebody doesn't want to pay their assessments and challenges it. Okay? Then it gets turned over to somebody like my law firm. I don't handle collections because I'm too nice. We have a whole department that's not so nice that handles our collections. But what happens is, if you haven't gone through the proper process of setting the assessments, and somebody challenges it, and we end up in court, in a court case over it, a lawsuit over it, they have a defense that you never set assessments. You never followed the budgetary procedures. You never gave us notice. If you're a Kiowa community, you didn't give us a chance to vote on the budget. If you're a pre-Kiowa community and there was an approval requirement in the declaration about how budgets are actually affirmatively approved, if you didn't follow that. So what they're going to argue is, and sometimes we can overcome it, but what they're going to argue is that you don't have a right to charge those assessments because you didn't follow the procedures to assess them in the first place. Okay? The other thing I just want to say generically, I specifically run into this with self-managed communities. Because you're all volunteers, you don't walk around with Kiowa in your back pocket like I do, right? You don't know these things. Sometimes you don't know where to look. Is that you shouldn't just say, oh, let's this year have assessments set at $250 a quarter. Your assessments need to be based on your expenses of your association and your contributions to reserves, okay? So don't just pull a number out of the air. Of course, that's something that you're keeping in the back of your mind, because I will tell you what happens with those communities. You will be underfunded. And when your infrastructure crumbles around you, particularly in a condominium, you can't replace roofs, you can't replace asphalt, and you've got nothing but knee-hole potholes in your asphalt. Your siding is leaking, you've got water intrusion. You don't have any money to carry out the responsibilities of the association. And then you either have to deal with the dreaded special assessment. How many of you had to do special assessments? How many of you have enjoyed those meetings? I mean, I hate annual meeting season, because if they haven't adequately reserved or adequately covered the common expenses of the community, those are the most unpleasant meetings I as an attorney go to. You know? Or what happens is, for a period of and this is not, I'm not, blowing this out of proportion. I'll have communities that for 10 years never increased assessments, even with cost of living going up, or the costs of, materials, maintenance, all of those kinds of things. And then you just don't have the money. So it's a painful process if your association has never done this before, but suffer through it and at least start educating your owners about the facts of life of assessments in associations, especially if you're a condominium association. How many of you live in condos? Yeah, it's mostly in Aspen. Single-family homes? Okay, single families usually are not quite as difficult because the owners are responsible typically for the exterior maintenance of their units, but it all depends on the declaration. It depends on what the obligations are. So it's a tough thing for everybody to swallow, but that's the facts of life. So if you're a pre-Kiowa community, getting back to this, your declaration just is either silent about budget approval, or your declaration says the board can set the budget and assessments. Kiowa now applies to you, and you have to go through the same budget ratification provisions that Kiowa communities did, except that the budget will be automatically approved unless 51%, not a higher percent, but 51% of all owners, remember, not of quorum, vote to veto the budget. If for Kiowa or pre-Kiowa communities a budget is vetoed, a ratified budget will stay in place until another budget goes through the process and is not vetoed. Okay? Yes?
Yeah, so my question is kind of about timing. And timing, the annual meeting likes to be in August, but the fiscal year and the budget start in July.
Oh.
And so we're in a situation where we're notifying people about the adopted board-approved budget.
But you haven't ratified it.
But it's not ratified
Right.
before we get to the owner meeting. How do we manage
Okay,
that?
so the question is, and this happens with a lot of communities, especially how many of you live in APCHA housing? Okay, how many of you live in, it's a second home kind of situation? Okay, so I run into this both with APCHA and condos that are second homes. And a lot of times the annual meeting, so first of all, let's always look at our bylaws to see if there's a specified date for an annual meeting set. I hate those provisions. And normally I work with my clients to amend them because we just want to make sure an annual meeting happens once a year. Not the third Tuesday of February of every year, whatever the requirement is. You want to have some flexibility, and I like to be able to have the board set the date of the annual meeting just so that there's some flexibility for these very reasons. So first of all, look at your bylaws, see if your bylaws set the date of the annual meeting. If they don't, we're good. The board can set the date of the annual meeting. If your annual meeting is required to be held before, hey Ron, before you would normally go through budget ratification, what you would need to do is call a special meeting of the board of directors. A special meeting of the owners, and consider budget ratification at that special meeting. All right? Or let's go into your bylaws and amend that date so you can hold it all at once. But if you can't do it at your annual meeting, hold a special meeting of the members to go through the process. Okay? Which just means you're going to be noticing and holding 2 membership meetings, and a lot of people don't want to go through that. But it's still doable. Yes?
When you say educate the owners about the budget, isn't just sending out a copy of the budget details enough?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, the question is educating the owner, sending a copy of the budget or summary enough? Yes, it can be. But what you're going to have is, for those of you, and don't raise your hands, I don't want to see, and I don't want it on TV. For those of you that have just been setting an assessment rate but never basing it on a budget, once you start going through the budgeting process, you may find that assessments are going to increase. As a matter of fact, I suspect you will find that. okay? And so that is when, the time people really show up at HOAs is when it affects their pocketbook. Is that right, Ron? That's when people show up, beating their desk, mad as bees or whatever. And so what you're going to have to do by actually going through the budgeting process, if it's going to increase assessments, is you really need to educate owners about why this is going up. And I always feel badly for those new boards that come on that were elected. You might have had a board regulating an association or governing an association for 15 years and they refuse to increase assessments. Finally, a new board comes on because you've got major financial problems and you've got to remedy them because you've got to put a new roof on because you're leaking and you've got mold and other issues. It's those boards that get the benefit of these other boards, and I say benefit in quotes, of these other boards never increasing assessments to cover the common expenses of the community. So that's when really starting to, if you know something like that's coming down the pike, really start educating their members ahead of time. You know, holding just meetings to discuss upcoming financial issues, because you hit them with a major assessment increase or a major special assessment, it won't be fun, okay? All right, so that's the basic budget ratification for pre-Kiowa communities and Kiowa communities. Cindy has the PowerPoint. Can you email this PowerPoint if people want it? She can email it and you can see it in larger print. So just let Cindy at APCHA know. All right. The other thing I wanted to cover this class was covenant and rule enforcement. And that's because I've had a lot of communities up here that have been really going through stuff lately with covenant enforcement and rule enforcement. So I don't want you to raise hands. How many of you are on boards? Raise hands on that. Okay, so most of you are directors. Okay, great. You don't have to raise your hand on this, but I just want to ask this hypothetical question. Do you have regular meetings? Do you take all of your governing documents to your meetings? Do you take your declaration? Do you take your rules and regulations? Do you have your bylaws? Because if you don't, you cannot govern your community. HOAs in Colorado, condominium associations and planned communities, are governed by the governing documents of the association, and they're also governed by some Colorado law. But the foundation of you as directors that you need, don't ever go to a meeting without your declaration. Because if you're a condo, you're not going to know who's required to maintain what. I hear all the time, well, it's not fair that the association has to maintain that. That should be an owner-required maintenance obligation. Well, that might seem fair to you, but I don't care about fair. It's what's in the declaration. And unless you have the declaration for your community that has the maintenance responsibilities for your community in it, you don't know the answer to that question. So I don't want you making decisions without knowing what the answer is. Yes?
Is it up to the duty, or is it the duty, though, of the board members to have to enforce this and follow, or is it, if you're a managed community, shouldn't the managers be the one responsible for having the decks and rules at the meetings?
So the question is, if it's a managed community, isn't it the manager's responsibility and not the board's? I would say both. I still don't want my boards going to meetings with no documents, okay? So as a board of a managed community, boards have the authority to enter into a contract with a managing agent, a management company, or a manager. But you still have responsibility as directors to ensure they're also following the governing documents and they're carrying out the obligations of the management contract. So how do you know if you don't know what the documents say, right? So I still want all my directors to be educated and be informed. Plus, it's not appropriate at times. Here's the other thing that happens. boards are required to give management direction on how they want them to carry out a particular obligation of the association. How can you give your management company or manager any kind of direction if you don't know what the documents require? You can't. And trust me when I tell you, lawyers like me wrote these documents and sometimes we're clueless, okay? So the documents might not make sense to you, so what you think would be the reasonable answer, the reasonable direction, might not be what your documents say. Yes?
Molly, if the board is elected on an annual basis, and if they want to, it's their responsibility to approve a contract with the managing agent. Would they have the authority to approve a contract that exceeds their term?
Okay, so the question is, the board, your boards only serves for 1-year terms?
They're reelected each year.
On a year? Wow. I have a few of those. So if the board is re-elected on an annual basis and that board is required to approve a management contract with an agent that's more than a year, do you have the legal authority to do that? And the answer is yes. What will normally happen in management contracts, because it's also part of your declaration, is a lot of times the declaration will say your management contract will be for 1 year, but typically management contracts will have an automatic renewal provision in them that says they are automatically reviewed, or they are automatically renewed for a period of 1 or more years if you don't give notice of termination. Okay, so yeah, I mean, you can, and you're going to also have potentially landscaping contracts that last more than a year. I mean, all of those things. So the board at the time entering into the contract has the right to do that. I don't love, how many of you have bylaws that say every year all the directors are reelected? I see those. I'll tell you why I don't like them. I have those, and I always, so a few of us, I'm glad that the minority of you raised your hand on that. And the reason I'm glad is, the reason I don't like that is unless you have people willing to continue to serve year after year and they get reelected, you have no continuity on your board. So what I prefer, and it's just my preference, is 3-year staggered terms or 2-year staggered terms. So at least there's a couple of directors on the board year to year that were on the board before. Otherwise, every year if you had new directors, they're reinventing the wheel every year with no historical knowledge of what's been going on. All right, so so this is really important since we have a lot of directors here and a lot of homeowners. So when I use the term covenant enforcement, I'm talking really about enforcing the restrictions in your declaration, and it's declaration singular, not plural. Do all of you in your real life business have a pet peeve when somebody says something that, when people say declarations, it drives me nuts. Because the declaration is one document and the covenants are all of the provisions in it. So it's a declaration. So directors have the duty to comply with and enforce the provisions of the declaration and comply with and enforce the provisions of your rules and regulations. If you want, I'm pretty easy to get along with in my practice. I work collaboratively with my associations, but I'll tell you the one time I'm not very pleasant is when directors are not complying with the documents, but they're enforcing against owners. You can't do that. Directors are owners too, so don't dislike your neighbor and enforce something against them that you yourself are not complying with. So first and foremost, directors have a fiduciary duty to comply with the governing documents of the association and to enforce them.
Is that a good example?
Here's a great example. A director puts a hot tub on their limited common element deck. Does that happen in Aspen? And the declaration specifically prohibits it. Yet they won't let somebody else do it. Or there's a prohibition on dogs in the community. And they have a dog, but they won't let anybody else have a dog. And we're not going to get into fair housing right now on that. But so those types, or this is better yet, guys. They're enforcing against all the owners to require them to pay their assessments, yet they're delinquent.
Yeah.
That happens, not a lot, but when it does, they need to resign from the board because you have no authority to enforce against the owners if you yourself are not complying. Yes?
So do you term that capricious and arbitrary enforcement? Other directors are doing something but then requiring someone else to...
Would directors violating their own documents but enforcing against others? Yeah, it's arbitrary and capricious and it's selective enforcement.
If a owner were to take the HOA to court over a matter like that, how do the courts look at something like that? If the directors are doing something that doesn't align with the declaration?
So what? So the question is, so you end up going to court and you're enforcing against an owner and the directors are not complying with their own provision. How do courts interpret that? You will be crucified in court. Not only will that happen to you, but under Colorado law, you will lose. And there's a provision in Kiowa that says the prevailing party is awarded their costs, their attorney fees and costs. So if you do something like that, hypothetically, and you lose in court, which you will, I mean, our firm and I would tell you, yeah, we're not going to court. Here's how we're fixing this situation. Because I'm not going to take you like a lamb to the slaughter, but it happens. What will happen is the judge will award under Kiowa the reasonable costs and attorney fees, and the association will have to pay the owner's fees.
So to finish that, what court would the owner take that to? Can you do that in small claims court? Is that district court? Is that federal court?
It's not federal court unless there's a Fair Housing Act violation. I suppose there's jurisdiction in federal court. You can, homeowners can enforce against associations. Homeowners can enforce use restrictions against other owners, okay? So it's not just the association enforcing against owners. Owners can enforce against owners. They can do that in the local courts, a small claims court sometimes. Also, the lowest trial court, I'm totally drawing a blank. County court. I'm general counsel. My job is to keep you out of court. And we have a litigation team at our firm who goes to court. But that's why I'm saying I would never let you go down those roads because it would be a disaster. Yes?
This is answering the question that I was going to ask about, again, what are the consequences for these various things as we go through today. But you mentioned about the HOA covering some of the legal fees, because you're putting yourself in the grave that you're digging when you sue someone if it's just going to come out of the HOA reserves on legal fees. So in these cases, when does the HOA, like if a member of the HOA were to sue a director or another member for not following the guideline, the declaration, singular.
Very well done.
The declaration, at what point does the HOA pay for those legal fees? Or is it the individual that's paying for those legal fees to defend that declaration?
Okay.
Or is the HOA, because if the HOA is paying for it, you're basically taking money out of your own pocket. Because I know that there's been several cases in Aspen where HOAs have lost huge legal fee things. And then they shouldn't have sued in the first place because they're just taking it out of their reserves.
Well, or their own pocket. So the question is, the comment actually is, were you listening to those congressional hearings today? Because I heard a lot of that. Well, the comment is, so the issue is, when somebody sues their HOA, aren't they essentially suing themselves, right? Because the association, if they prevail, is ultimately out of pocket for the cost of the litigation, sometimes, okay? Sometimes insurance will cover it. But ultimately, it comes back to the association, because if somebody sues a board for not adequately maintaining the common elements, for breach of fiduciary duty, for not enforcing the governing documents, a lot of times the directors and officers liability coverage will provide a defense on that, okay? However, let me finish. However, I guarantee you, and they may or may not, depending on your insurance coverage, if there's damages, pay damages. A lot of times, D&O coverage will cover the defense, but if there's monetary damages, will not necessarily cover that. But ultimately, what is going to happen is if you get sued and the insurance company has to go and defend you and potentially pay the damages, your premiums are going to skyrocket. And especially with D&O coverage, I have had a lot of clients get their D&O coverage canceled. And so they have to go to excess lines that are extremely expensive. So the moral of that story is not that owners don't at times have an absolute reason to sue an association. I mean, there are times when boards just refuse to do what they're required to do under the documents. They just won't do it. Those are very rare in my experience, okay? What I like to do with my clients is if we're going down the road toward litigation, I like to get my clients into mediation prior to it blowing up. In mediation is where you bring in an independent third party to sit with the association and the owners who are upset and to try to work out the issue and to mediate the issue. And a lot of times that, if you get it in soon enough to mediation, you can get around litigation. But I've also noticed up here, because I represent a multitude of different types of clients, if you have a lot of people with a lot of money, they don't care, they're just gonna sue you. And I run into that too, especially with the high-end resort condominium communities. That will happen. And you just end up in litigation and you just deal with it. And if the insurance company takes it under a reservation of rights, typically meaning they will defend the association, but they will not pay damages. If damages are awarded to the owner against the association pays, and I've seen special assessments to cover damages in a lawsuit. So the moral of the story is be reasonable and try to work things out.
I was just going to address that very topic because we have a situation where
Can we do the next slide?
a homeowner, multiple homeowners, threatened to sue the board of directors, and the insurance agent said to me, do not go there. He said, not only won't I be able to get your policy for at least 3 years, minimum, he said, no one will touch your D&O insurance for a minimum of 3 years. So you're not going to have any D&O insurance. And then once I get you another policy, it's going to cost you at least 100% more.
Yeah, so that's where insurance brokers come in and say, don't submit. And I say, can I use the HELL word? What in the hell is insurance for? You know, I mean, if there's a legitimate claim and the association's getting sued, this is one of my pet peeves, because especially with things like major water leaks and water losses in a condominium, if depending on what your insurance requirements are, you'll sometimes get brokers saying, don't submit it. Well, if it's way over the association's insurance deductible, the association's required to cover the cost of what their insurance would cover. And so I get claims histories affect premiums, I do. But there's times when that's what you have insurance for, you know? So that's a tough issue. And I just have issue, I would say if your broker's telling you to never submit a legitimate claim, you need to look at other brokers.
Yeah.
Yes. Would you agree?
When you're on
What's that?
both, were you talking about?
Yes. Yes, thank you for, so everything from here on out applies to pre-Kiowa and Kiowa communities. Thank you for asking that good question, okay? All right, so what are covenants? So covenants are found in the declaration, the condominium declaration if you're a condo, or what's typically called the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions if you're a single-family home community, okay? And we'll go to the next slide.
Are covenants interchangeable with rules?
No.
Okay.
I'm going to cover rules in a second. So covenants, I call them, here's normal things that you find these are all covenants, okay? But what we're going to focus on is the last one, use restrictions. But covenants require association members to pay assessments, the dues. They require you to maintain, repair, and replace particular components of your home, of your unit. They require the association and the owners to carry specified amounts of insurance coverage on their homes. And then the last one, which is what we normally end up going down the road on, is they contain use restrictions on how you're permitted to not or to use your unit or the common elements. Could you go to the next slide, Cindy? So, yes.
So what happens when somebody doesn't pay their assessments?
You should, so the question is, what happens if someone doesn't pay their assessments? You're required to have 9 responsible governance policies under Colorado law. One of those is a collections policy. You're going to follow the procedure. Here's the problem with self-managed communities, is it's really hard to come down on your neighbor, right? Who you have a glass of wine with. But this is a good question. I think this is one of the most important obligations of a board, is to enforce assessment delinquencies. So what you do is you're required to give them notice of the assessment delinquency. They have 30 days to respond to the notice of the assessment delinquency. They have a one-time, and this is all statutory, and this would be in your collections policy that you're all required to have. And if you haven't updated your collections policy since 2014, it does not comply with Colorado law, and you need a new one. You're obligated to provide an owner with a one-time opportunity at a payment plan of at least 6 months to bring their account current. If they do not enter into a payment plan or pay in full, then at that juncture, you can turn it over to association counsel. We will place a lien on their unit, and we will also send out another demand that they are required to pay. If they do not pay, contact us to, to pay it or enter into an enforceable payment plan, we will bring a county court legal action and go after them. Gosh, I wish I had my collections department here. It usually takes about 3 months. And we have had really, really good luck with collecting. So any attorney that does this is typically going to have somebody in their firm that does collections for you. And the cool thing under Colorado law is the legal costs and attorney fees get rolled into the assessment delinquency, and the owner ends up paying them. Okay? A 1.5 delinquency, okay, go through the process, make sure you have a collections policy, and start going through the process. They're not taking contact from legal counsel? They're having a hard time serving them with a lawsuit. Get a good process server that knows the tricks. Good process servers will find somebody at their favorite watering hole and serve them with a lawsuit. So there's different tricks of the trade. So it's about getting a good process server. You can also foreclose on a unit if their assessments are in arrears 6 months or more, but the board has to vote to approve foreclosure.
Are you going to cover how to, like you said, update the collection policy and what that process looks like?
That wasn't my plan today, but we can do that at a future class. All right, so common use restrictions. So let's get back to enforcement. Pets are huge, right? Dogs. Leasing restrictions. You know, the minimum term of a lease, how many units may be leased, whether you can have roommates, those kinds of things are common. Parking restrictions are common, where you can park. Are they limited common element? Are they open to anybody? Can you be towed? I don't know why I put window coverings in. Some associations and condos will regulate window coverings and say it has to be white on the outside. It just depends. You can't have the American flag or a ripped up towel hanging from your window that somebody can see. And then here's a biggie that I run into up here all the time, especially in condos. People making improvement to the common elements without approval from the association. They put a shed out. They put a hot tub up. They put, I mean, the balcony is a limited common element, and they store all their stuff for months. Any of you, does this sound familiar? This is what I deal with my clients up here all the time. All of these, typically, there's going to be provisions of the declaration that cover these types of things. Noise-related nuisances are typically going to be recovered by your declaration. Then, let's do the next one, a rule. So rules are adopted by the board, and boards have, look in your declaration for the rulemaking authority from the board. If your declaration is silent, what happens is under Kiowa, you have broad rulemaking authority. So here's kind of, gosh, it's Old Home Week. Hi. Here is kind of my rule of thumb when I'm working with my clients. When you're adopting rules, adopt rules regulating what goes on in units very carefully, okay? Because we don't want to overly regulate what people do inside their homes that nobody knows about, right? I don't care, and you shouldn't either. I'm using you generically. So when I say if you're going to regulate what somebody does in their unit, you should only be regulating it if it affects the use and enjoyment of another unit or the common elements, okay? They're noisy. We've got smoke migrating because of the construction of the unit. We have cigarette smoke, marijuana smoke. Incense I've run into up here a lot that migrates from one unit into the next unit or onto the common elements, making it difficult for people to live in their homes or use their common elements. So I'll see sometimes, and more down in the Front Range, and I'm like, seriously? I live in an HOA too, just so you know. Why do you need 40 pages of rules? You know? Especially if you're not enforcing them. Remember, the board has the obligation to comply with and enforce the rules. So rules should be judicious, and they should just be what matters to the community. Like a lot of things with rules are things like what you can store on your deck, when you put your trash out, the noise you make, things like that. But sometimes, you know, making sure that you're putting your trash in the dumpster that locks so the bears don't take up residence in your community, stuff like that. So rules should fit your community. They should be reviewed, I'd say every 2 to 3 years to make sure they still make sense. The board can adopt and amend rules. The declaration, to amend the use restrictions in the declaration typically requires consent of 67% of the owners. Your rules also can never trump your declaration. So let's say you've got a 2-dog use restriction in your deck. You can only have 2 dogs, or 2 dogs, 2 cats, or a combination thereof, whatever it is. You cannot say, well, we really want to allow people to have 4, so we're just going to adopt a rule and ignore the deck. You can't trump provisions of the declaration through a rule, okay? Let's go on to the next one, Cindy. Go on to the next one. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Okay, tips on rulemaking. Is it getting warm in here, or is it I'm 55?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So rules cannot trump the provisions of your declaration, so don't try to get around your deck through rules. State them in a clear manner. Don't be a lawyer and use a bunch of stuff that nobody understands what they mean. They should be reasonable and not excessive. What we can really get into problems with are, I see this more in Colorado Springs because we have a lot of military that are there. And my husband's retired military, but he's back there and we've mellowed him out. But a lot of law and order people want a rule for everything. And most people don't want to live in communities where there's a rule for everything, right? They just want to be able to live their life and not inappropriately impose upon other people. So make sure they're reasonable. And again, they must be related to a legitimate purpose. And that's where, again, I say, if it affects the use and enjoyment of another unit or the common elements, then it's legitimate. And they have to be enforceable. I'll tell you, one of the hardest provisions of a declaration, and these have to be in decks and not rules, they cannot be addressed in rules, are leasing restrictions. Especially since housing up here is so doggone expensive, a lot of people have a lot of roommates. And it is so, if you've got numbers of people who can live in a unit in your documents, how do you enforce that? And I always say, how do you count toothbrushes? How do you prove somebody's actually living there? Because I guarantee you, they're going to say, oh, I'm not living there, I'm just visiting. Or it's my boyfriend, I'm in and out. I don't live there, I've got an apartment here, or whatever. It is extremely difficult to enforce some rules. So take into mind, how are you going to enforce it? How are you going to be able to prove that somebody is violating it? And so I just go through that process when you're looking at rules. Yeah.
So in regard to that, what is your opinion on if the rules are not onerous, on the board being proactive in enforcing rules versus operating on a complaint basis?
Okay, so the question is, should a board be proactive in enforcing rules or operate on a complaint basis? Most of my boards that are self-managed operate on a complaint basis. Honestly, I don't really want my boards out on milk boxes looking over someone's fence to see if there's a violation. You know? But if there's a complaint or a clear violation that you can see, doing periodic walkthroughs, yes. Where I do want boards to be proactive is when there's issues with people making improvements to the common elements or limited common elements without approval. Putting that hot tub on the deck that's a limited common element deck without approval. Enclosing a deck that's a limited common element deck without approval. Putting a shed, you're in a condo and you only own the airspace unit, you know, the interior of your unit essentially. Putting a shed out behind your condo without written approval. All of those things have to be approved by the board of directors. So those types of things, I want my boards to be really diligent about. You see it, it's there in the open. Because I have had a lot of Aspen clients who have me come in and try to enforce it way after the fact, and it's a nightmare. Okay?
What about items that, like in the rules, as far as going back to rules, say they want rules governing certain things that are subjective as to whether it does or does not increase the property value. Somebody's concerned that the appearance of dirt bikes that aren't licensed might decrease property values, where it's like, how do you prove that it does or doesn't?
Well, and so that, and I'm just going to say, especially in the affordable housing communities, the condos, there's not a lot of storage in a lot of these places. And so the question is, when you're regulating what may be stored or kept outside, how do you know if it does or does not increase property values? I don't know. That to me is not the issue. The issue is everybody okay with people's junk all over? You know, and I've had people in some communities I'm putting up a shower curtain under that deck so you can't see it, but you get to see a plastic shower curtain. Or I'm going to put all my crap up there and you can't say anything about it because it's mine, I own it, and they don't realize it's a limited common element deck. Or I'm leaving kids' stuff. I mean, I love kids, okay? But I'm going to just leave it laying all over the yard and never pick it up in the evening to put it away. Stuff like that. It just depends on your community, and it really is a community issue of what, in my opinion, from a rule perspective, because remember, rules can be changed, and it should fit the priorities of your community. But what are you willing to tolerate? So you have some people who are pristine. For most of us, that's probably not all that reasonable, right? We don't live. When I was a baby lawyer, I lived in an apartment next to this wonderful older woman. She was in her 80s. I loved her. She had this house, and she was the most active 80-year-old. She had a push mower, you know, not a motorized mower, push, and her lawn was a putting green. And I'd be out on a date, and she'd turn on the yard light for me when I came home. Because, you know, she wanted me to make sure I got safely up to the front door. But she kept her yard. It could have been in Better Homes and Gardens. It was stunning. That's not realistic for most of us, right? And so it's finding that what's reasonable and what are people willing to live with, you know?
So what if you have, let's say, not to take up time with one specific person, but let's say you've got the president of the whole Commons Association who takes it upon himself to deem certain rules are his pet things, and it might not necessarily be what the entire rest of the association likes.
Okay, so there's always one, okay, in every community. If there's rules that people don't agree with, change the doggone rules, okay? And that's why I want them looked at every 2 to 3 years, because the board can approve rule changes, all right? And if everybody hates a rule and they think it's ridiculous, and trust me, I'm sure you all have rules that are, because they've been there for 20 years and nobody's ever changed them, change them. Or if the board doesn't want to enforce a rule, get rid of it. You know, if you're not going to, you can't get rid of use restrictions because those have to be approved by the owners in the declaration, but rules you can change.
I'm confused. The difference between rules and covenants. You can change rules, but you can't change covenants?
Right. You can, all right, covenants are in your declaration, and the only way those can be amended is if they're formally approved by the owners, which typically requires a 67% consent of the owners, depending on your deck, but that's a general.
The board itself can change rules, but the owners have to vote on covenants.
Yes. So covenants changed by the owners, rules changed by the board. Rules can't trump provisions of the deck that you don't like.
A lot of what people are saying seems to come down to also like interpretation of covenants.
So
we have covenants that are so vague that some people, it says no large commercial deals. What is a large commercial?
okay, so the question is, if the covenants are vague about what something is, what do? How do you interpret it? You use a rule to interpret it. Okay, so the board adopts a rule saying a large commercial vehicle is X. Okay? Or at some point you say, we've just got to amend this because it's so vague, or it just doesn't make sense, let's get rid of it. So, but amending your declaration is a lot more entailed than a rule change, okay? All right, where are we, Cindy? Okay. Successful enforcement of covenants and rules. I'll tell you a way to stay out of rule hell is to remind people what they are. So you've got two types of people in HOAs, in my opinion. Those who violate because they don't even know the rules exist, right? They didn't know. Truly. And then those that are thumbing their nose at you and just saying, I don't care what you say, I'm going to violate it. I could use other more colorful language that I will refrain from. But anyhow, so there are two types of, in my opinion, violators. So what we want to do is gain voluntary compliance with rules. So that means the rules are reasonable and people have buy-in to them. There's consensus that they make sense. So if you've got one director who insists on rules that nobody in the community buys into and nobody on the board wants to approve, get rid of them, okay?
Director?
Well, or owner, yeah. So consistency and enforcement is critical. What we were talking about earlier, you can't have directors violating the rules and then enforce against owners, or you can enforce against people you don't like, but not enforce against your neighbor. You've got to enforce consistently on a case-by-case basis, understandably. I mean, there is one PETA in every community, and that's a pain in the... and there's going to be one person that's going to drive you crazy. Do you have one? Does everybody have one in their community?
Just one.
How many with more than one? That's just HOAs. But that doesn't mean you go against them, even though they drive you nuts and all they do is complain. They complain, complain, complain with no solutions. You know who I'm talking about, right? But that doesn't mean you can just go against them and not go against other people for the same violations. All right, so let's follow your enforcement policy, the next page. Remember I talked about 9 responsible governance policies? One of those, I'm sorry, I have allergies, one ear keeps popping. One of those you're required to have is an enforcement policy.
So what if certain things have historically not been enforced, but rules haven't been changed to reflect that?
All right, what happens if you haven't been enforcing historically and the rules haven't changed? If it's in a rule, get rid of it. Because if you haven't enforced it for 10 years, you're not going to enforce it. Amend your rules, get rid of it. Or change it to make sense. If it's in your covenants, there are, let's say you enforce against somebody for something that they claim hasn't been enforced. There's different defenses they have in a legal action, and one of them is waiver, where basically they say everyone in the association knows you're not enforcing the pet restrictions, so everybody's gotten a dog. And we've been doing this for years. Everybody knows they're there. And so to go and enforce them now in court is going to be impossible, and there's an equitable defense called waiver. Okay? And that means the association has waived the right to enforce. If there's something in the use restrictions that past boards have not enforced that you want to start enforcing, I call it drawing a line in the sand, and that is where you give notice to the owners that this provision of the declaration is in existence, written notice, it hasn't been enforced, and beginning in a period of time, 90 days from now, we will begin enforcing. Okay? So you give people time to come into compliance and enforce. For things like dogs, I'll tell you, what I will tell my clients is, since we've allowed it all this time, we haven't done anything about it, basically don't enforce against the dogs that are in the community, but don't permit additional dogs in the future. But we're not getting into fair housing today because that will take us down a rabbit hole for hours. Yes?
Someone that's dog sitting other dogs.
If dogs are prohibited in your community, what do you do about somebody who's dog sitting other dogs? You tell them they can't do it, and you take enforcement action against them.
I mean, you know they're going to pay.
It doesn't matter. If dogs are prohibited, they're prohibited. And it could also be a violation of your business, of the ability to have a home business in your community. There could be a provision in your deck on that. All right, yes, one more question that I'm going on to enforce.
This may be a question for Cindy. Is there parts of the declaration or covenants within the declaration that are restricted to change based on APCHA's holding on the deed restriction?
I would have to, you would have to tell me which one specifically.
Like, let's say there's an HOA that doesn't allow dogs, and they want to allow dogs. Does that have to be approved through APCHA?
No.
Are there cases in those scenarios? Are there things
There is
that
not.
have to be approved through APCHA?
You couldn't
Renters and that sort of stuff is approved through APCHA. those
So
probably
there,
follow the
so
APCHA
again, it would
guidelines.
depend on if it follows the guidelines, because the decks also, I think, relate to the guidelines.
So
Yeah.
when an APCHA HOA makes a change to the declaration, they should probably check with APCHA whether or not it's a restricted part
Yeah.
of their declaration.
And
based
hopefully,
on APCHA's.
hopefully your legal counsel's also looking at, is it violating the deed restriction or the guidelines? I mean, we all know leasing in APCHA communities is something that, we have to deal with. Okay, so I'm going to go through really quickly based on our enforcement policy that our firm drafts, but everybody needs to get an enforcement policy and you follow your enforcement policy. I'm just using our enforcement policy as an example of how you enforce. And when you're enforcing, I'm talking about levying fines, giving notice of the violation, an opportunity to stop the violation, and if they don't, the process you're required to go through to levy fines.
Does that end up in your declarations, or is that just?
That's a standalone a policy. It might be in your deck, but you also have to have a policy. Okay? So the first thing that you're do is somebody's going to bring a complaint to the board, or the board's going to see its own violations, and they're going to have the management company or somebody on the board send out an initial violation saying, Molly, you're violating section 12.2 of the rules because you've got crap all over your deck. Okay? And you have 14 days to come into compliance and to clean it up. All right, so I have a period of time. I know what the violation is. It's specified in the letter. I have 14 days. If I do not come into compliance within 14 days, a second letter goes out. You can go to the next. The second letter says, okay, here's the violation. It hasn't been cured. You haven't done what you're supposed to come in compliance. You are going to have, we're going to have a hearing on July or August 3rd at 3 p.m. at the library on whether or not a fine should be levied against you for this violation. Okay? And then you hold a hearing. An owner's not required to come to the hearing. Hopefully they will, because the whole point of the hearing is for them to be heard and to have a conversation. But the second letter should talk about the date, time, location of the hearing, the process for the hearing, and the use of an impartial decision maker. And that's, the board can either act as the impartial decision maker holding the hearing, or you can, if it's really ugly and the owners think the board's out against them, I'll have my clients designate a hearing committee of other owners in the community to be the hearing committee, the impartial decision maker. Then you hold a hearing. It's usually informal. You say, these are the violations. What's your side of the story? And then you have a conversation about it. And they can bring other people in to testify if they want, but you don't, it's not a legal hearing. The rules of evidence don't apply. It's a conversation with your neighbors. And then at the following, once everybody's had an opportunity to say what they want to say, and I do not want my board or decision maker, my impartial decision makers fighting with them. And I know that that's really hard, but the worst thing, have you been to these hearings where the board's just screaming at the owners? That's not constructive. What we want to do is hear what they have to say about their alleged violation. And once it's over, the board or impartial decision maker can meet in executive session to decide what they want to do. Do they want to levy a fine? Do they want to levy a fine but say if there's no more violations in 6 months, we'll waive it? How do they want to handle it? And then they have to give written notice of the fine that's levied and when they have to pay it. Fines are treated just like any other assessment delinquency, okay? I'm sorry, you guys, it's getting hot in here. Next page. If the individual doesn't attend the hearing, you can go on with the hearing and just base it on what evidence that you have. They can send written information into you about the hearing to say, this is what I think, please take this into consideration. You can do that. If they don't attend the plea or the hearing or don't request another hearing date, you can treat it as a no contest plea. In other words, you can treat it as if the person is not challenging the alleged violation and take action based on that. Okay, Cindy.
Can all these meetings be held by email, especially if it's a second?
Not a hearing.
Who's not in state?
No, but you can hold them by phone. Okay. The decision should be rendered on all the relevant facts and circumstance. Like I said, you can either tell them what the decision of the board is at, or the impartial decision maker at the hearing, or you can do it in writing after the fact based on your enforcement policy. And the decision has to be fair and reasonable, okay, in light of the violation. Okay, Cindy. Options that are available: assess fines. And the enforcement policy has to have a fine provision, a schedule of fines in it. I also draft into mine provisions that say if it's a willful and wanton violation, if somebody's thumbing your nose at you and just saying, I don't care what you say, we're not going to comply, it allows the board to go outside of the fine schedule and hit them with a harder fine, a higher fine. We also have the ability to, if your declaration permits it or your bylaws, suspend membership privileges. So if you have amenities, like I don't know if many of you have a pool, but if you have amenities, you can stop them from using it. You can stop them from voting if it's in your bylaws or your declaration, those types of things. And the last thing is if their violation caused property damage, you can require them to pay the cost of repairing it. Okay? Yes?
We back up a sec. So an owner files a complaint over a rule or a declaration, a policy violation. If you have a paid secretary with your association and a volunteer president of your association, who's to take action? Who's to follow up on the complaint?
Okay.
Instead of just falling dead on deaf ears.
Okay, so the question is, who sends out the violation letter? The board's required to make sure it's sent out. So either somebody on the board does or some paid staff member, but the board has a responsibility to make sure it's sent out. I'm sorry, guys. I'm having a little blood sugar thing here. All right. Unique enforcement circumstances. Habitual offenders and continuing violations. So the steps I talked about in terms of going through and fining people, that's just one of the remedies. If you have somebody that's doing something that's really bad and they won't come into compliance, we'll file a lawsuit to get a court order for them to comply. Okay? That's another option. Willful and wanton violators, make sure your enforcement policy has a provision which allows you to fine outside the fine schedule. So I'll hit them with a $2,000 fine. If they're basically saying, I don't care what you say, we're doing it, you can't stop us. Responsibilities for tenants. It depends on what the declaration says. Unless the declaration gives the association the authority to enforce directly against a tenant, the association can only enforce against the owner. So if you're amending your documents, let's make sure your deck is amended to include the authority of the association to enforce against a tenant. For violations or offenses that constitute a present danger, let's say somebody has flammable materials in their garage that could explode and cause a problem, and they refuse to do anything about it, and a fine's not going to fix it, that's when we go to court, and we get a court to order them to come into compliance. Okay? All right. I think that's about it. Yes?
One question on a bad landlord. Maybe you can stop them from being in the rent.
Can you stop someone from renting their unit if they're a bad landlord? Not unless your declaration permits it. But you can enforce against them and fine the heck out of them. You can also take them to court if they're not requiring their tenants to comply and have the court force them to comply. Okay? Yes? who pays the legal fees? The association will pay them, but hopefully you'll prevail and the court will make the bad landlord reimburse the association. We always make a claim for reimbursement. Yes.
Where can we find those 9 required governance policies?
You have an attorney draft them for you. We don't have. I don't have templates. We just give out, but.
So that CCIOA doesn't.
No, Kiowa just says what they are.
It says what they are.
Yeah, it gives you a list of them. Yeah.
If you're pre-Kiowa and an owner brings an action against the association and loses, is that as automatic as a Kiowa?
Typically it is, in terms of the legal fees.
Okay.
Sometimes, though, judges will like to split the baby, so to speak, and say, you won, but we're only going to award, these fees are excessive, so we're only going to award 40% of them. So we kind of get to know the judges and can tell you if they're going to do that.
What about access to someone whose unit is an inside unit? Where is that?
I would not stop them from getting to their unit as a way to enforce. I've had people say, let's turn off their water. They can't use the elevator. I wouldn't go that far. I don't think a court would support that.
What if a neighbor on the end will not let people on the inside, going on the inside use their unit, go outside?
In their common element stairs?
This is a town of,
Are they elevators?
four units, and there's like 3 in a group or 4 in a group.
And they won't let them use the stairs to get to their units?
No, they won't let them walk around the common elements to get to their unit.
Well, they can't stop that. The board needs to get involved in that. Okay. All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming. One more question.
So apparently, the local police force refuses to come on to private property to do things like remove vehicles that are apparently abandoned and things.
Yeah, they won't tow off private property.
Yeah, so what as a board can we do? Like, let's say somebody's just left a bunch of dirt bikes and they just left. We called towing company one in town for the owners apparently, and the police won't come and take them away.
So what happens if people leave their stuff all over? You give them notice within a specific
We don't know
period.
whose stuff it is. It's unregistered. They're just
So you
there.
give a notice to the community that this stuff is going to be removed within X period of time if they don't pick it up, and then at that period of time you remove it. Okay? Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Sorry it got a little warm. Mm-hmm.